Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Joe Biden says there's only 10 years left for the planet.
Today, one of every three Americans lives in a city or a state transitioning to clean energy, electricity. But folks, we have to pick up the pace. When I rejoined the Paris Climate Accord after we had been pulled out of it, the goal set when our last administration, the Obama-Biden administration, when that was set, they were set that we had more time. We don't have the time now. The goals are different because the necessity is there. We don't have a lot of time. We don't have much more than 10 years, for real.
So sometime around the year 2030, the planet is going to be destroyed by global warming. The new warning is almost as frightening as the one which came out in 1989. Grim Forecast, a senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures could create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. So global warming destroyed the planet 20 years ago, and it's going to destroy the planet again in the year 2030. I was a little surprised by Biden's announcement because the last time he was in the White House, him and Obama healed the planet.
And I am absolutely certain that generations from now, we will be able to look back and tell our children that this was the moment when we began to provide care for the sick and good jobs to the jobless. This was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal.
Unless you have a PhD in climate science, these mixed messages may appear a little bit confusing. Joe Biden made his announcement on September 15th, 2021. Prior to the year 1960, September 15th was frequently a very hot day in the United States. On September 15th, 1927, half of the United States was over 90 degrees. Most of the eastern half of the United States was over 90 degrees, and many locations were over 100 degrees, shown with these purple dots. We very rarely get days this hot in July anymore, much less in the middle of September. It was so hot in mid-September 1927 that Chicago schools had to shut down on account of intense heat. September 1927 was a very busy month. On September 7th, the west coast of Mexico was swept by a tidal wave which killed hundreds of people. 3 days later, 5,000 lost their lives in a typhoon in China. And 3 days after that, a typhoon and tidal wave in Japan wrecked towns near Nagasaki, killed many, and did vast damage. And then on September 29, 1927, one of the worst tornadoes in U.S. history largely destroyed St. Louis, Missouri. This is what Enright Avenue in St. Louis looked like after the passage of the cyclone. It was a very wide tornado which destroyed block after block of houses. Carbon dioxide levels were just above 300 parts per million, which climatologists consider to be extremely safe. And if that wasn't bad enough, a few weeks later Vermont had their worst flood on record. More than 1,000 bridges along the Winooski River were washed away, and the lieutenant governor drowned in the flood. I lived in Winooski for a while and used to ride my bike across the river on the way to work. The high water mark from this flood was clearly marked on a building and looked pretty frightening. And earlier in the year, the worst floods in U.S. history occurred along the Mississippi River. The floods lasted for more than 6 months and drove huge numbers of descendants of slaves who had sharecropped along the Mississippi River into northern cities. The 1927 flood on the Mississippi River fundamentally changed the demographics of the United States. The Red Cross said that floods and tornadoes made 1927 the worst disaster year in their history. And a year earlier, in mid-September 1926, Miami was largely wiped off the map by a Category 4 hurricane. The weather was much more extreme in the 1920s than it has been in recent years, and I wonder why Joe Biden doesn't remember. Biden has a lot of difficulty reading a teleprompter, but he says that if we listen to him, he can prevent bad weather in the future. H.L. Mencken said, "As democracy is perfected, the office of president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron." It would appear, based on Mencken's description, that our democracy has finally been perfected. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on climate insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.